It is Saturday, January 30th, 6:20 p.m., and we're going to read the second lecture of 8 lectures on yoga. Mr. Chairman, Your Royal Highness, Your Grace, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. In my last lecture I led you into the quag of delusion. I smothered you in the mire of delusion. I brought you to thirst in the desert of delusion. I left you wandering in the jungle of delusion, a prey to all the monsters which are thoughts. It came into my mind that it was up to me to do something about it. We have constantly been discussing mysterious entities if we knew something about them, and this, on examination, always turned out not to be the case. Knowledge itself is impossible, because if we take the simplest proposition of knowledge, S is P, we must attach some meaning to S and P, if our statement is to be intelligible. I say nothing to whether it is true, and this involves definition. Now the original proposition of identity, A equals A, tells us nothing at all, unless the second A gives us further information about the first A. We shall therefore say that A is BC. Instead of one unknown, we have two unknowns. We have to define B as DE, C as FG. Now we have 4 unknowns, and very soon we have used up the alphabet. When we come to define Z, we have to go back and use one of the other letters, so that all our arguments are arguments in a circle. Any statement which we make is demonstrably meaningless, and yet we do mean something when we say that a cat has 4 legs, and we all know what we mean when we say so. We give our assent to, or withhold it from, the proposition on the grounds of our experience. But that experience is not intellectual, as above demonstrated. It is a matter of immediate intuition. We cannot have any warrant for that intuition, but at the same time any intellectual argument which upsets it does not in the faintest degree shake our conviction. The conclusion to be drawn from this is that the instrument of mind is not intellectual, not rational. Logic is merely destructive, a self-destructive toy. Logic is merely destructive, a self-destructive toy. The toy, however, is in some ways also instructive, even though the results of its use will not bear examination. So we make a bylaw that the particular sorties which annihilate logic are out of bounds, and we go on reasoning within arbitrarily appointed limits. It is subject to these conditions that we may proceed to examine the nature of our fundamental ideas, and this is necessary, because since we begin to consider the nature of the results of meditation, our conceptions of the backgrounds of thought are decided in quite a different manner, not by intellectual analysis, which as we have seen carries no conviction, but by illumination, which does carry conviction. Let us, therefore, proceed to examine the elements of our normal thinking. I need hardly recapitulate the mathematical theorem which you all doubtless laid to heart when you were criticizing Einstein's theory of relativity. I only want to recall to your minds the simplest element of that theorem, the fact that in order to describe anything at all, you must have 4 measurements. It must be so far east or west, so far north or south, so far up or down, from a standard point, and it must be after or before a standard movement. There are 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time. Now what do we mean by space? Henry Poincaré, one of the greatest mathematicians of the last generation, thought that the idea of space was invented by a lunatic, in a fantastic and evidently senseless and aimless endeavor to explain to himself his experience of his muscular movements. Long before that, Kant had told us that space was subjective, a necessary condition of thinking, and while everyone must agree with this, it is obvious that it does not tell us much about it. Now let us look into our minds and see what idea, if any, we can form about space. Space is evidently a continuum. There cannot be any difference between any parts of it because it is wholly where. It is pure background, the area of possibilities, a condition of quality and so of all consciousness. It is therefore in itself completely void. Is that right, sir? Now suppose we want to fulfill one of these possibilities. The simplest thing we can take is a point, and we are told that a point has neither parts nor magnitude, but only position. But as long as there is only one point, position means nothing. No possibility has yet been created of any positive statement. We will therefore take 2 points, and from these we get the idea of a line. Our Euclid tells us that a line has length but no breadth. But as long as there are only 2 points, length itself means nothing, or at the most it means separateness. All we can say about 2 points is that there are 2 of them. Now we take a third, and at last we come to a more positive idea. In the first place we have a plane surface, though that in itself still means nothing, in the same way as length means nothing when there are only 2 points there. But the introduction of the third point has given a meaning to our idea of length. We can say that the line AB is longer than the line BC, and we can also introduce the idea of an angle. A fourth point, provided that it is not in the original plane, gives us the idea of a solid body. But as before, it tells us nothing about the solid body as such, because there is no other solid body with which to compare it. We find also that this is not really a solid body at all as it stands, because it is merely an instantaneous kind of illusion. We cannot observe or even imagine anything unless we have time for the purpose. What then is time? It is a phantasm, exactly as tenuous as space, but the possibilities of differentiation between one thing and another can only occur in one way instead of in three different ways. We compare two phenomena in time by the idea of sequence. Now it will be perfectly clear to all of you that this is all nonsense. In order to conceive the simplest possible object, we have to keep on inventing ideas, which even in the proud moment of invention are seen to be unreal. How are we to get away from this world of phantasmagoria to the common universe of sense? We shall require a lot of more acts of imagination. We have got to endow our mathematical conceptions with three ideas which Hindu philosophers call Sat, Chit, and Ananda, which are usually translated being, knowledge, and bliss. This really means Sat, the tendency to conceive of an object as real; Chit, the tendency to pretend that it is an object of knowledge; and Ananda, the tendency to imagine that we are affected by it. It is only after we have endowed the object with these dozen imaginary properties, each of which, besides being a complete illusion, is an absurd, irrational, and self-contradictory notion, that we arrive at even the simplest object of experience. And this object must, of course, be constantly multiplied, otherwise our experience would be confined to a single object incapable of description. We have also got to attribute to ourselves a sort of divine power over our nightmare creation, so that we can compare the different objects of our experience in all sorts of different manners. Incidentally, this last operation of multiplying the objects stands evidently invalid, because, after all, what we began with was absolutely nothingness. Out of this we have somehow managed to obtain not merely one, but many, but for all that our process has followed the necessary operation of our intellectual machine. Since that machine is the only machine that we possess, our arguments must be valid in some sense or other, comfortable with the nature of this machine. What machine? That is a perfectly real object. It contains innumerable parts, powers, and faculties, and they are as much a nightmare as the external universe which it has created. Gad, sir, Patanjali is right. Now how do we get over this difficulty of something coming from nothing? Only by inquiring what we mean by nothing. But we shall find that this idea is totally inconceivable to the normal mind, for if nothing is to be nothing, it must be nothing in every possible way. Of course, each of these ways is itself an imaginary something, and there are alpha 0, a transfinite number of them. If, for example, we say that nothing is a square triangle, we have had to invent a square triangle in order to say it. But take a more homely instance. We know what we mean by saying there are cats in the room. We know what we mean when we say no cats are in the room, but if we say no cats are not in the room, we evidently mean that some cats are in the room. This remark is not intended to be a reflection upon this distinguished audience. So then, if nothing is really to be the absolute nothing, we mean that nothing does not enter into the category of existence. To say that absolute nothingness exists is equivalent to saying that everything exists which exists, and the great Hebrew sages of old time noted this fact by giving it the title of the supreme idea of reality, behind their tribal god Jehovah, who, as we have previously shown, is merely the yoga of the four elements, even at its highest, the demiurgos. Aheye asher aheye, I am that I am. If there is any sense in any of these at all, we may expect to find an almost identical system of thought all over the world. There is nothing exclusively Hebrew about this theogony. We find, for example, in the teachings of Zoroaster and the Neoplatonists, very similar ideas. We have a pleroma, the void, a background of all possibilities, and this is filled by a supreme light god, from whom derive, in turn, the 7 archons, who correspond closely to the 7 planetary deities, Eretron, Bethor, Phaleg, and the rest. These in their turn constitute a demiurge in order to create matter, and this demiurge is Jehovah. Not far different are the ideas both of the classical Greeks and the Neoplatonists. The difference in the terminology, when examined, appears not much more than the differences of local convenience in thinking. But all these go back to the still older cosmology of the ancient Egyptians, where we have Nuit, space, Hadit, the point of view. These experience Congress and so produce Heru Raha, who combines the ideas of Rahur Kuit and Horpor Krat. These are the same twin Vau and He final which we know. Here is evidently the origin of the system of the Tree of Life. We have arrived at this system by purely intellectual examination, and it is open to criticism, but the point I wish to bring to your notice tonight is that it corresponds closely to one of the great states of mind which we reflect the experience of Samadhi. There is a vision of peculiar character which has been of cardinal importance in my interior life, and to which constant reference is made in my magical diaries. So far as I know, there is no extant description of this vision anywhere, and I was surprised on looking through my records to find that I had given no clear account of it myself. The reason apparently is that it is so necessary a part of myself that I unconsciously assume it to be a matter of common knowledge, just as one assumes that everyone knows that one possesses a pair of lungs and therefore abstains from mentioning the fact directly, although perhaps alluding to the matter often enough. It appears very essential to describe this vision as well as possible, considering the difficulty of language and the fact that the phenomena involved logical contradictions, the conditions of consciousness being other than those obtaining normally. The vision developed gradually. It was repeated on so many occasions that I am unable to say at what period it may be called complete. The beginning, however, is clear enough in my memory. I was on a great magical retirement in a cottage overlooking Lake Pestwany in New Hampshire. I lost consciousness of everything but in universal space, in which were innumerable bright points, and I realized that this was a physical representation of the universe, in what I may call its essential structure. I exclaimed nothingness with twinkles. I concentrated upon this vision, with the result that the void space which had been the principal element of it diminished in importance. Space appeared to be ablaze, yet the radiant points were not confused, and I thereupon completed my sentence with the exclamation, "But what twinkles?" The next stage of this vision led to an identification of the blazing points with the stars of the firmament, with ideas, souls, etc. I perceived also that each star was connected by a ray of light with each other star. In the world of ideas, each thought possessed a necessary relation to each other thought. Each such relation is a course of thought in itself, each such ray is itself a star. It is here that logical difficulty first presents itself. The seer has a direct perception of infinite series. Logically, therefore, it would appear as if the entire space must be filled up with a homogeneous blaze of light. This is not, however, the case. The space is completely full, yet the monads which fill it are perfectly distinct. The ordinary reader might well exclaim that such statements exhibit symptoms of mental confusion. The subject demands more than cursory examination. I can do no more than refer the critic to Bertrand Russell's Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy, where the above position is thoroughly justified, as also certain positions which follow. I want you to note in particular the astonishing final identification of this cosmic experience with the nervous system as described by the anatomist. At this point we may well be led to consider once more what we call the objective universe, and what we call our subjective experience. What is nature? Immanuel Kant, who founded an epoch-making system of subjective idealism, is perhaps the first philosopher to demonstrate clearly that space, time, causality, in short, all conditions of existence, are really no more than conditions of thought. I have tried to put it more simply by defining all possible predicates as so many dimensions. To describe an object properly is not sufficient to determine its position in the space-time continuum of 4 dimensions, but we must inquire how it stands in all the categories of scales, its values in all kinds of possibility. What do we know about it in respect of its greenness, its hardness, its mobility, and so on? And then we find out that what we imagine to be the description of the object is in reality nothing of the sort. All that we recorded is the behavior of our instruments. What did our telescopes, spectroscopes, and balances tell us? And these again are dependent upon the behavior of our senses, for the reality of our instruments, of our organs of sense, is just as much in need of description and demonstration as are those remote phenomena. And we find ourselves forced to the conclusion that anything we perceive is only perceived by us as such, because our tendency is so to perceive it. And we shall find in the 4th stage of this great Buddhist practice, Maha Satipatthana, we become directly and immediately aware of this fact, instead of digging it out of the holts of these interminable authorities which badger us. Kant himself put it, after his fashion, the laws of nature are the laws of our own minds. Why? It is not the contents of the mind itself that we can cognize, but only its structure. But Kant has not gone to this length. He would have been extremely shocked if it had ever struck him that the final term in his sorties was reason itself as the only reality. On further examination, even this ultimate truth turns out to be meaningless. It is like the well-known circular definition of an obscene book, which is one that arouses certain ideas in the mind of the kind of person in whom such ideas are excited by that kind of book. I notice that my excellent chairman is endeavoring to stifle a yawn and to convert it into a smile, and you will forgive me for saying that I find the effect somewhat sinister. But he has every right to be supercilious about it. These are indeed old fond paradoxes to amuse wives in alehouses.
Since philosophy began, it has always been a favorite game to prove your axioms absurd. You will all naturally be very annoyed with me for indulging in these fatuous pastimes, especially as I started out with a pledge that I would deal with these subjects from the hard-headed scientific point of view. Forgive me if I have toyed with these shining gossamers of the thought web. I have only been trying to break it to you gently. I proceed to brush away with a sweep of my lily-white hand all this tenuous, filmy stuff, such stuff as dreams are made of. We will get down to modern science. For general reading, there is no better introduction than The Basis of Modern Science, by my old and valued friend, the late J.W.N. Sullivan. I do not want to detain you for too long with quotations from this admirable book. I'd much rather you got it and read it yourself. You could hardly make better use of your time. But let us spend a few moments on his remarks about the question of geometry. Our questions of space as a subjective entity have been completely upset by the discovery that the equations of Newton based on Euclidean geometry are inadequate to explain the phenomena of gravitation. It is instinctive to us to think of a straight line, it is somehow axiomatic, but we learn that this does not exist in the objective universe. We have to use another geometry, Riemann's geometry, which is one of the curved geometries. There are, of course, as many systems of geometry as there are absurd axioms to build them on. 3 lines make 1 ellipse. Any nonsense you like. You can proceed to construct a geometry which is correct so long as it is coherent, and there is nothing right or wrong about the result. The only question is, which is the most convenient system for the purpose of describing phenomena? This means that the phenomena are not taking place against a background of a flat surface. The surface itself is curved. What we have thought of as a straight line does not exist at all, and this is all impossible to conceive. At least it is quite impossible for myself to visualize. The nearest one gets to it is by trying to imagine that you are a reflection on a polished doorknob. I feel almost ashamed of the world that I have to tell you that in the year 1900, 4 years before the appearance of Einstein's world-shaking paper, I described space as finite yet boundless, which is exactly the description in general terms that he gave in more mathematical detail. You will see at once that these 3 words do describe a curved geometry. A sphere, for instance, is a finite object, yet you can go over the surface in any direction without ever coming to an end. I said above that Riemann's geometry was not quite sufficient to explain the phenomena of nature. We have to postulate different kinds of curvature in different parts of the continuum, and even then we are not happy. Now a spot for Sullivan. The geometry is so general that it admits of different degrees of curvature in different parts of spacetime. It is to this curvature that gravitational effects are due. The curvature of spacetime is most prominent, therefore, around large masses, for here the gravitational effects are most marked. If we take matter as fundamental, we may say that it is the presence of matter that causes the curvature of spacetime. But there is a different school of thought that regards matter as due to the curvature of spacetime. That is, we assume a fundamental spacetime continuum which is differently curved in different parts of it. These local peculiarities of the spacetime continuum manifest to our senses as what we call matter. Both points of view have strong arguments to recommend them. But, whether or not matter may be derived from the geometrical peculiarities of the spacetime continuum, we may take it as an established scientific fact that gravitation has been so derived. This is obviously a very great achievement, but it leaves quite untouched another great class of phenomena, namely electromagnetic phenomena. In this spacetime continuum of Einstein's, the electromagnetic forces appear as entirely alien. Gravitation has been absorbed, as it were, into Riemannian geometry, and the notion of force, so far as gravitational phenomena are concerned, has been abolished. But the electromagnetic forces still flourish undisturbed. There is no hint that they are manifestations of the geometrical peculiarities of the spacetime continuum, and it can be shown to be impossible to relate them to anything in Riemann's geometry. Gravitation can be shown to correspond to certain geometrical peculiarities of the Riemannian spacetime, but the electromagnetic forces lie completely outside this scheme. Here's the great quag into which mathematical physics has led its adepts. Here we have 2 classes of phenomena, all part of a unity of physics. Yet the equations which describe and explain the one class are incompatible with those of the other class. This is not a question of philosophy at all, but a question of fact. It does not do to consider that the universe is composed of particles. Such a hypothesis underlies one class of phenomena, but it is nonsense when applied to electromagnetic equations, which insist upon our abandoning the idea of particles for that of waves. Here's another Welsh rabbit for supper. Einstein's finite universe is such that its radius is dependent upon the amount of matter in it. Were more matter to be created, the volume of the universe would increase. Were matter to be annihilated, the volume of space would decrease. Without matter, space would not exist. Thus, the mere existence of space, besides its metrical properties, depends on the existence of matter. With this conception, it becomes possible to regard all motion, including rotation, as purely relative. Where do we go from here, boys? The present tendency of physics is towards describing the universe in terms of mathematical relations between unimaginable entities. We have got a long way from Lord Kelvin's too often and too unfairly quoted statement that he could not imagine anything of which he could not construct a mechanical model. The Victorians were really a little inclined to echo Dr. Johnson's gross imbecile stamp on the ground when the ideas of Bishop Berkeley penetrated to the superficial strata of the drink-sodden grey cells of that beef-witted brute. Now, look you, I ask you to reflect upon the trouble we have taken to calculate the distance of the fixed stars, and hear Professor G. N. Lewis, who suggests that two atoms connected by a light ray may be regarded as an actual physical contact. The interval between two ends of a light ray is, on the theory of relativity, 0, and Professor Lewis suggests that this fact should be taken seriously. On this theory, light is not propagated at all. This idea is in conformity with the principle that none but observable factors should be used in constructing a scientific theory, for we can certainly never observe the passage of light in empty space. We are only aware of light when it encounters matter. Light which never encounters matter is purely hypothetical. If we do not make that hypothesis, then there is no empty space. On Professor Lewis's theory, when we observe a distant star, our eye as truly makes physical contact with that star as our finger makes contact with a table when we press it. And did not all of you think that my arguments were arguments in a circle? I certainly hope you did, for I was at the greatest pains to tell you so. But it is not a question of an argument in Mr. Sullivan's book. It is a question of facts. He was talking about human values. He was asking whether science could possibly be cognizant of them. Here he comes, the great commander. Cheer, my comrades, cheer. But although consistent materialists were probably always rare, the humanistically important fact remained that science did not find it necessary to include values in its description of the universe, for it appeared that science, in spite of this omission, formed a closed system. If values form an integral part of reality, it seems strange that science should be able to give a consistent description of phenomena which ignores them. At the present time, this difficulty is being met in two ways. On the one hand, it is pointed out that science remains within its own domain by the device of cyclic definition, that is to say, the abstractions with which it begins are all it ever talks about. It makes no fresh contacts with reality, and therefore never encounters any possibly disturbing factors. The point of view is derived from the theory of relativity, particularly from the point of presentation adopted by Eddington. This theory forms a closed circle. The primary terms of the theory, point events, potentials, matter, etc., there are 10 of them, lie at various points on the circumference of the circle. We may start at any point and go round the circle, that is, from any one of these terms we can deduce the others. The primary entities of the theory are defined in terms of one another. In the course of this exercise we derive the laws of nature studied in physics. At a certain point in the chain of deductions, at matter, for example, we judge that we are talking about something which is an objective concrete embodiment of our abstractions. But matter, as it occurs in physics, is no more than a particular set of abstractions, and our subsequent reasoning is concerned only with these abstractions. Such other characteristics as the objective reality may possess never enter our scheme, but the set of abstractions called matter in relativity theory do not seem to be adequate to the whole of our scientific knowledge of matter. There remain quantum phenomena. Ah! So we leave her, far from where her swarthy kindred roam, in the scarlet fever, convalescent home. So now, no less than that chivalrous gentleman, His Grace the Most Reverend the Archbishop of Canterbury, who in a recent broadcast confounded forever all those infidels who had presumed to doubt the possibility of devils entering into swine, we have met the dragon science and conquered. We have seen that however we attack the problem of mind, whether the customary spiritual standpoint or from the opposite corner of materialism, the result is just the same. One last quotation from Mr. Sullivan. The universe may ultimately prove to be irrational. The scientific adventure may have to be given up. But that is all he knows about science. Bless his little heart, we do not give up. You lied, Diormia, I do not repent. The results of experiment are still valid for experience, and the fact that the universe turns out on enquiry to be unintelligible only serves to fortify our ingrained conviction that experience itself is reality. We may then ask ourselves whether it is not impossible to obtain experience of a higher order, to discover and develop the faculty of mind which transcends analysis, stable against all thought by virtue of its own self-evident assurance. In the language of the great white brotherhood whom I am here to represent, you cross the abyss. Leave the poor old stranded wreck Ruach and pull for the shore of Neshama. For above the abyss, it is said, as you will see if you study the supplement to the 5th number of the 1st volume of the Equinox, an idea is only true insofar as it contains its contradictory in itself. It is such states of minds as this which constitute the really important results of samyama, and these results are not to be destroyed by philosophical speculation, because they are not susceptible of analysis, because they have no component parts, because they exist by virtue of their very unreason. Certum est qui impossibile est. They cannot be expressed, for they are above knowledge. To some extent, we can convey our experience to others familiar with that experience to a less degree by the aesthetic method, and this explains why all the good work on yoga, alchemy, magic, and the rest, not doctrinal but symbolic, the word of God to man, is given in poetry and art. In my next lecture, I shall endeavor to go a little deeper into the technique of obtaining these results, and also give a more detailed account of the sort of thing that is likely to occur in the course of the preliminary practices. Love is the law, love under will. It's 7:23 p.m. and we're going to read Chapter 7 of Liber Samadhi. More rubbish has been written about Samadhi than enough. We must endear to avoid adding to the heap. Even Patanjali, who is extraordinarily clear and practical in most things, begins to rave when he talks about it. Even if what he said were true, he should not have mentioned it, because it does not sound true, and we should make no statement that is a priori improbable without being prepared to back it up with the fullest proofs. But it is more than likely that his commentators have misunderstood him. The most reasonable statement of any acknowledged authority is that of the Yajnavalkya, who says, by pranayama impurities of the body are thrown out, by dharana the impurities of the mind, by pratyahara impurities of attachment, and by samadhi is taken off everything that hides the lordship of the soul. There is a modest statement in good literary form, if we can only do as well as that. In the first place, what is the meaning of the term? Etymologically, sam is the Greek sin, the English prefix sin meaning together with. Adhi means Lord, and a reasonable translation of the whole word would be union with God, the exact term used by the Christian mystics to describe their attainment. Now there is a great confusion, because the Buddhists use the word samadhi to mean something entirely different, the mere faculty of attention. Thus, with them, to think of a cat is to make samadhi on the cat. They use the word jhana to describe mystic states. This is exceedingly misleading, for as we saw in the last section, dhyana is a preliminary of samadhi, and of course jhana is merely the wretched plebeian pali corruption of it. There are many kinds of samadhi. Some authors consider Atma Darsana, the universe as a single phenomena without conceptions, to be the first real samadhi. If we accept this, we must relegate any less exalted states to the class of dhyana. Patanjali enumerates a number of these states. To perform these on different things gives different magical powers, or so he says. These do not need to be debated here. Anyone who wants magic powers can get them in dozens of different ways. Power grows faster than desire. The boy who wants money to buy lead soldiers sets to work to obtain it, and by the time he has got it, wants something else instead, in all probability something just beyond his means. Such is the splendid history of all spiritual advance. One never stops to take the reward. We shall therefore not trouble at all about what any samadhi may or may not bring as far as its results in our lives are concerned. We begin this book, it will be remembered, with considerations of death. Death has now lost all meaning. The idea of death depends on those of the ego, and of time. These ideas have been destroyed, and so death is swallowed up in victory. We shall now only be interested in what samadhi is in itself, and in the conditions which cause it. Let us try a final definition. Dhyana resembles samadhi in many respects. There is a union of the ego and the non-ego, and a loss of the senses of time and space and causality. Duality in any form is abolished. The idea of time involves that of two consecutive things, that of space two non-coincident things, that of causality two connected things. These dhyanic conditions contradict those of normal thought, but in samadhi they are very much more marked than in dhyana, and while in the latter it seems like a simple union of two things, in the former it appears as if all things rushed together and united. One might say that in dhyana there was still this quality latent, that the one existing was opposed to the many non-existing. In samadhi, the many and the one are united in a union of existence with non-existence. This definition is not made from reflection but from memory. Further, it is easy to master the trick or knack of dhyana. After a while one can get into the state without preliminary practice, and looking at it from this point, one seems able to reconcile the two meanings of the word, which we debated in the last section. From below, dhyana seems like a trance, an experience so tremendous that one cannot think of anything bigger, while from above it seems merely a state of mind as natural as any other. Frater P., before he had samadhi, wrote of dhyana, perhaps as a result of the intense control, a nervous storm breaks. This we call dhyana. Samadhi is but an expansion of this, so far as I can see. 5 years later he would not take this view. He would say perhaps that dhyana was a flowing of the mind in one unbroken current from the ego to the non-ego without consciousness of either, accompanied by a crescent wonder and bliss. He can understand how it is the natural result of dhyana, but he cannot call dhyana in the same way the precursor of samadhi. Perhaps he does not really know the conditions which induce samadhi. He can produce dhyana at will in the course of a few minutes' work, and it often happens with apparent spontaneity. With samadhi, this is unfortunately not the case. He probably can get it at will, but could not say exactly how, or tell how long it might take him, and he could not be sure of getting it at all. One feels sure that one can walk a mile along a level road. One knows the conditions, and it would have to be a very extraordinary set of circumstances that would stop one. But though it would be equally fair to say, I've climbed the Matterhorn and I know I can climb it again, yet there are all sorts of more or less probable circumstances, any one of which would prevent success. Now we do know this, that if thought is kept single and steady, dhyana results. We do not know whether an intensification of this is sufficient to cause samadhi, or whether some other circumstances are required. One is science, the other empiricism. One author says, unless memory deceives, that 12-second steadiness is dharana, 144 dhyana, and 1728 samadhi. And Vivekananda, commenting on Patanjali, makes dhyana a mere prolongation of dharana, but says further, suppose I were meditating on a book, and I gradually succeeded in concentrating the mind on it, and perceiving only the internal sensation, the meaning unexpressed in any form, that state of dhyana is called samadhi. Other authors are inclined to suggest that samadhi results from meditating on the subjects that are in themselves worthy. For example, Vivekananda says, think of any holy subject, and explains this as follows. This does not mean any wicked subject. Frater P. would not like to say definitely whether he got dhyana from common objects. He gave up the practice after a few months and meditated on the chakras, etc. Also, his dhyana became so common that he gave up recording it. But if he wished to do it this minute, he would choose something to excite his godly fear or holy awe or wonderment. There is no reason why dhyana should not occur when thinking of any common object of the seashore, such as a blue pig. But Frater P.'s constant reference to this as the usual object of his meditation need not be taken to the foot of the letter. His records of meditation contain no reference to this remarkable animal. It will be a good thing when organized research has determined the conditions of samadhi, but in the meantime there seems no particular objection to our following tradition, and using the same objects of meditation as our predecessors, with the single exception we shall note in due course. The first class of objects for serious meditation, as opposed to preliminary practice, in which one should keep to simple recognizable objects whose definiteness is easy to maintain, is various parts of the body. The Hindus have an elaborate system of anatomy and physiology, which has apparently no reference to the facts of the dissecting room. Prominent in this class are the 7 chakras, which will be described in Part 2. There are also various nerves, equally mythic. The second class is objects of devotion, such as the idea or form of the deity, or the heart or body of your teacher, or of some man who you respect profoundly. This practice is not to be commended because it implies a bias of the mind. You can also meditate on your dreams. This sounds superstitious, but the idea is that you have already a tendency, independent of your conscious will, to think of those things, which will consequently be easier to think of than others. That this is the explanation is evident from the nature of the preceding and subsequent classes. You can also meditate on anything that especially appeals to you. But in all this, one feels inclined to suggest that it will be better and more convincing if the meditation is directed to an object which in itself is apparently unimportant. One does not want the mind to be excited in any way, even by adoration. See the 3 meditative methods in Liber HHH. At the same time, one would not like to deny positively that it is very much easier to take some idea towards which the mind would naturally flow. The Hindus assert that the nature of the object determines the samadhi, that is, the nature of those lower samadhis which confer the so-called magic powers. For example, there are the yoga pravarti. Meditating on the tip of the nose, one obtains what may be called the ideal smell, that is, a smell which is not any particular smell, but is the archetypal smell, of which all actual smells are modifications. It is the smell which is not a smell. This is the only reasonable description, for the experience being contrary to reason, it is only reasonable that the words describing it should be contrary to reason too. Similarly, concentration on the tip of the tongue gives the ideal taste, on the dorsum of the tongue, ideal contact. Every atom of the body comes into contact with every atom in the universe all at once, in the description Bhikkhu Anandamattheya gives of it. The root of the tongue gives the ideal sound, and the pharynx the ideal sight. The samadhi par excellence, however, is Atma Darsana, which for some, and those not least instructed, is the first real Samadhi, for even the visions of God and of the self are tainted by form. In Atma-darsana, the all is manifested as the one. It is the universe freed from its conditions. Not only are all forms and ideas destroyed, but also those conceptions which are implicit in our ideas of those ideas. Each part of the universe has become the whole, and phenomena and noumena are no longer opposed. But it is quite impossible to describe this state of mind. One can only specify some of the characteristics, and that in language which forms no image in mind. It is impossible for anyone who experiences it to bring back any adequate memory, nor can we conceive a state transcending this. There is, however, a very much higher state called Siva Darsana, of which it is only necessary to say that it is the destruction of the previous state, its annihilation, and to understand this blotting out, one must not imagine nothingness, the only name for it, as negative, but as positive. The normal mind is a candle in a darkened room. Throw open the shutters and the sunlight makes the flames invisible. That is a fair image of Dhyana. But the mind refuses to find a simile for Atma-darsana. It seems merely ineffective to say that the rushing together of all the host of heaven would similarly blot out the sunlight. But if we do say so, and wish to form the further image of Siva Darsana, we must imagine ourselves as suddenly recognizing that this universal blaze is darkness, not a light extremely dim compared with some other light, but darkness itself. It is not the change from the minute to the vast, or even from the finite to the infinite. It is the recognition that the positive is merely the negative. The ultimate truth is perceived not only as false, but as the logical contradictory of truth. It is quite useless to elaborate this theme, which has baffled all other minds hitherto. We have tried to say as little as possible rather than as much as possible. Still further from our present purpose would it be to criticize the innumerable discussions which have taken place as to whether this is the ultimate attainment, or what it confers. It is enough if we say that even the first and most transitory dhyana repays 1,000-fold the pains which we have taken to attain it. And there is the anchor for the beginner, that his work is cumulative. Every act directed towards attainment builds up a destiny which must someday come to fruition. May all attain.